Good afternoon. My name's Jonathan Norman from the Major Projects Association, and I'm delighted to be talking to Eric Lynn about the subject of project culture. So before we get on to that, Eric, do you want to say a few words about yourself and what you do?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me, Jonathan. Where do I start? In a nutshell, I work as an organization development consultant, although I'm not particularly friendly with the term of consultant. I've spent the last 40 years or so working internationally in the field of people development, and the last 25 years or so working in the arena of organization development, which I understand ought to have the purpose of cultivating healthy organizations. And whether an organization is a classical institution or corporation or a small company or a project, the principles are very, very similar, although many details will be significantly different.
Great, thank you. We're talking about this concept of project culture. So do you want to give me a quick off the cuff definition? What is project culture?
The thing about culture is that it's not definable. On the one hand, it's ever present. It's there. It's a bit like air in the environment. We take it for granted. We don't really notice it until it's bad. And culture itself is a dynamic. And culture describes the quality of relationships and the quality of interactions within the organization that is the project. And in that, it's continuously changing because every interaction is changing something or other. When I speak about healthy organizations or about a healthy culture, I tend to think in terms of cultivating an environment in which healthy interactions become the norm. That's it in a nutshell. So on the one hand, it's beyond definition. On the other hand, there's a certain paradox here. On the other hand, we can't get away from it.
These projects tend to be activities that involve a number of organizations. So do you tend to see that it's maybe the client organization, or is there one predominant organization's culture that tends to pervade the project and become the project culture? Or do you see a different culture often emerging when organizations get together to deliver a project?
The answer to that question is yes, because of course I see both. Having worked on numerous international projects encompassing often multiple organizations, including institutions, when they're done right, the very first step is to get the project team, the project group, and particularly initially the project leadership, aligned and focused on what the project is and the significance of relationships. Because everything in life is relational. It's about the quality of relationships. I've never ever worked on a project in which the technical challenges have been really the real issues. Put a group of engineers together, they'll overcome them. That's why they're there, and that's what they love doing. Unfortunately, on far too many projects that I've experienced, the focus at the beginning is purely on, excuse me, on the technical issues, structures, finances, etc. There's little or no attempt made to enable the people to build the relationships that they need, or even to attain a common understanding of what they're supposed to be doing together and how they're supposed to be working with one another and where the connection points are, etc., etc. And this is when the problems arise. I was having a conversation yesterday with a colleague and saying it would be so much cheaper for clients if they called us in at the beginning of projects rather than when things begin to go wrong, and essentially we're acting as mediators. You know, the more complex the project, the greater the need for doing this work up front. And the point is, it's something that is never done as such. You can't tick it off. Like week 25, that's done. No, it's continuous work. It goes through from the beginning, prior to the beginning of the project, actually, right through to the end.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, culture is clearly not a cause and effect activity. Organizations are quite good at cause and effect. They like projects that you do this and you end up with that. But culture is, I guess, is a much more emergent thing. Depends on the nature of the project that you're doing, and it depends on the individual players within the project organization. So how can organizations practically, where do they get started with this? How can they get started with it?
It starts with the leadership and the sponsors. And I include the sponsors amongst the leadership because they are so influential, as they should be. You need sponsors who realize that projects are fundamentally about people. They're not about the technology. They're fundamentally about the people, because it's the people actually who either develop or implement the technological solutions. And once you have that recognition, then the question becomes, how can we do this? And I say you need an external facilitator to facilitate that process. And when I say facilitation, I mean facilitate in terms of opening a space for the group to do what it needs to do. I don't mean being directive.
Right, I understand.
There is a significant difference because an external has no interest whatsoever in which path they decide to take.
Yes.
Particularly when you have multiple organizations involved, particularly when institutions are involved, there are always interests. You can't get away from those. That's just part of the nature of life. So how can we cultivate this environment where people put those to the side and say, okay, it's in everybody's interest to do this together? And actually, it's a lot more fun as well. And, you know, not to speak of, I mean, how many major projects do not overrun their budgets?
Sure. Yes.
I don't know, but I'd be surprised if the figure was greater than 10%. Okay. I'd be very surprised.
Yes. Well, given that it's so fundamental to the successful delivery of a complex project, why is it that organizations struggle so much with this whole question?
It's not just about projects. They struggle with similar questions within their organizations, within the way they design their organizations, because we tend to see organizations as mechanical units to be tweaked and manipulated according to the will of the leaders. And the people in there are resources. You know, which term do we use in organizations to refer to people? Human resources. That's neither particularly respectful, nor is it particularly generative. We don't recognize that organizations themselves are alive, living organisms. I think organizations are asking themselves the wrong questions. And too often it's presented as a dichotomy. Okay, well, if we invest in people, then we have less profits. It's actually not, it's a false dichotomy. When we invest in relationships, it's not only about investing in people, it's investing in relationships among the people. That's the key thing. Then your profits are highly likely to actually increase. So if we transfer that to projects, it's the same thing. You're
Right.
going to have fewer personal conflicts. You might have professional conflicts, but they can be positive if the personal relationships are positive. You
Yes.
know, particularly, I mean, projects are intended to actually bring something new in the world, aren't they?
Yes.
And then they're done. So the professional differences are actually positive.
Yes.
So how do we cultivate that environment in which they can come to the surface in a positive manner?
Yes.
And the
Yes.
group works together to overcome the challenge.
Right. So, I mean, I'm intrigued because, there are often commercial requirements that organizations use competitive tendering and are very transparent in the way that they invite other organizations to work with them in projects. And yet that sounds a little counterintuitive given what you're saying. I mean, it would seem to me that if you manage to build a healthy project culture on one project with a specific mix of individuals and organizations, it would make absolute sense to maintain that culture onto another project. Or is that actually a mistake?
It's absolutely not a mistake. And I often ask myself, once they've experienced this, why don't they transfer it? And individuals actually do. You know, I mean, I'm speaking from experience of individuals with whom I worked who were project managers, with whom I worked in their position as project managers or program managers going back, I don't know, over 20 years. And we're still in touch, and they still function in the same way from the learnings they had then.
Mm.
Now, the thing is, you know, when I'm working as an external project consultant, consultant to a project, I will always recommend finishing up with a kind of lessons learned, but in an interactive environment. And one of the questions is always, what can we take back to our organization?
Yes.
But then you need people in the organization who are going to say, aha, how can we learn from this?
Yeah.
And there's no guarantees. And of course, within organization, I mean, people move.
Yes.
There are, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was not uncommon for people to stay in one organization for life. Now, of course, we still have that, but it's far less common than it used to be.
Yes. Yes. So given the challenge of this and the complexity of this process, and the fact that, as you say, it's quite rare for organizations to devote sufficient time to this in the kind of early stages of the project. If I'm working on a project, how can I get some sense of whether the culture is healthy or unhealthy? And are there things I can do once the project started to actually kind of shift us back towards some healthier ground, as it were?
In asking this question, are you speaking now as a project manager, for
Yeah.
example?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. On the one hand, we've got the conventional metrics.
Mm-hmm.
Are we within schedule?
Mm-hmm.
Are we delivering in terms of quality and within schedule? And what about the budget? On the one that, they're fairly conventional and relatively easy to ascertain. On the other hand, you look at how people are interacting with each other. Are they picking up the phone? Are they, do they recognize how interrelated their work is?
Yes.
Do they explicitly recognize how they need one another?
Yes.
When they get stuck, what do they do? What kind of environment encompasses the conversations they're having?
Yes. Yes.
What are sickness levels? What about on longer term projects? How many people are actually leaving, not for natural reasons? No. Good people tend to get offers they can't refuse. That happens.
Mm-hmm.
But are leaving for, let's say, psychological reasons.
Right. So
It's these are the things.
so if
And
I
of course,
identify those,
mhm,
what do I do?
when you identify that things are not going as well as they ought to be, first of all, it requires the recognition from the
Mhm.
project manager. These are not technical issues. And then find somebody who is qualified to add support. And I use the word support, not help.
Mm.
And that includes the recognition that a consultant will not provide you with answers. A consultant would find the questions that you need to ask yourself as project manager, so that the group will find their answers. That, for me, is the role of the consultant, not to provide answers.
Very good, very good. So I know that you're pursuing this subject with the Enlightened Enterprise Academy. So I wondered if you wanted to say just a few words about what you were doing with them, and maybe just to flash your book in front of us as well, for those who would like to know
Well,
more.
Paul Barnett, who you know too, the founder of the Enlightened Enterprise Academy, picked up on my book just before I was due to publish it, Dancing with Change, Cultivating Healthy Organizations, and wrote a review on it, and then invited me to develop a 10-week online program, an executive briefing program entitled Cultivating Healthy Organizations. We're both very open that ideally we'd hold this as an executive retreat, but in times of COVID, that is not possible. This program, running an online program, on the other hand, does give people an opportunity to learn the principles, to interact with one another. There's a lot of personal questioning in this, because it all begins with me, always, regardless of the work, regardless of the context. And it enables people from anywhere to participate. I'll post the link to this afterwards with it. We're starting on the 14th of April, after Easter, for 10 weeks there.
Eric, that's tremendous. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your time.
Thank you for inviting me, Jonathan.